I'm David with EV Raceworks, and today we are putting the Moto brake on Surge Sully's Surron. So we're going to start out with just doing the rear with the handbrake, and then we'll also put on the dual to show you how to put on 2 calipers so you can run the rear brake with either hand or foot. So stick with it and we'll get this thing running. Okay, we're gonna start by pulling the battery, and if you have a front fender, pull that, but Sully already broke it. And then we will pull off the old brakes and start routing the new line for the new Moto brakes. I pulled off the rear caliper, the stock caliper, unscrewed it from the brake line, connected to the stock master cylinder, and then after that I started undoing wires up here, undoing the little rubber clips, undo P-clip here, 2 P-clips under here, and the motor controller upper cover plastic. I unscrewed the 5 screws that are in the bottom of the plate here, the battery plate. Sometimes there's foam on this plate, so you have to scrape it off in order to see the heads of the screws. To get this brake sensor out of the master cylinder, it's the second wire that comes out of here. You have to undo the set screw on the bottom of the master cylinder, and then you can unscrew the sensor. This is the cutoff for turning off the motor if the brake is engaged. So we're just going to tuck this under here because the new master cylinder doesn't have a brake sensor. Now the next thing we're going to do is take off the rear axle, undo the chain to get it all free, because we're going to need to replace this bracket right here with a new one. Once the rear wheel is removed, it's time to put in the new beefy rotor. So just 6 Torx screws. Put on the new one, reusing the same screws as the old one. Okay, now we've got the rotor on, we got to put our brackets on. So if you're running a dual setup, it looks like this. If you're running a single, it looks like this. The rest of the process is going to be identical though, regardless of if you're doing single or dual. On this new brake line, there are 2 different fittings. You'll see one is angled and one is straight. The angled one goes on the rear caliper and the straight one goes up on the master cylinder. What you have to do to run this line is there's this back cover behind the battery tray. That's got to be loosened up. There's 2 screws down there, and then there's another cover that goes on there onto this. Remove that. Right now this cover is kind of flapping around, which is what we need. We're going to start by putting the angled end through under here. Keep feeding it through this back piece of plastic, kind of out by the jack shaft. And you can see we're running it over the jack shaft cover, getting it back to where the caliper will be. For now, we won't worry about this end. We'll just stick it up here kind of out of the way. So now that the line is mostly through the center of the bike, everything still needs to be tightened down, but the next step is kind of mocking up where this will be so we can get the length right. You're gonna have the fitting oriented like this. Banjo bolt, one of the washers goes on, put it through the fitting, then the other washer goes on, and now you can screw it into the caliper. So we're just gonna go hand tight right now, nothing crazy, just mocking it up. And once that's snug, in your kit there's screws, there's split lock washers, and then there's flat washers. First you put on the split lock washer, then you put on the flat washer, and then it tightens down the bracket. So now that this is somewhat secure back here, we're just going to work from the backwards forwards, kind of re-securing all of the screws we took out. So first with P-clip here, plastic covers here, getting the line under the battery tray along this edge, close this plastic back up, and retighten the motor controller once it's all nicely tightened up. 2 P-clips up here, and then that's fully secured. This little plastic cover goes on the back of the battery plastics. You could open this up a little bit larger to make room for the bigger brake line, but I just opt to not run this part. All right, so the line is ran all the way from the rear to the front, going nicely under the battery tray, behind the little plastic shield, under this plastic, P-clip, 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 and out the top. So next step is just send it between the forks up to kind of where the master cylinder, and next is mount the master cylinder up and we'll get bleeding. To mount the master cylinder, I just scoot the screen over just temporarily. We'll be able to move it back into place here in a little bit, but just 2 screws to clamp this thing back down, and we're just gonna temporarily mount it so it's kind of level with the ground, because we're gonna fill this up and we don't want it spilling everywhere. So a critical portion of this step is to back this screw out, this adjuster screw, till the handle's floppy. So what this does is it allows the fluid to flow in freely down the line, and it really helps with bleeding. So we're gonna crack open this jam nut, loosen it a little bit, and then back this screw out just until the handle's nice and flopping around. So it's critical to use .3, 4, or 5.1 brake fluid. The difference between the 3 is just a higher boiling point, so 5.1 is the best, but they're all cross-compatible, so use whatever you've got. Just make sure that it's not super old and doesn't have any water in it. That would be real bad. So I'm gonna first remove the banjo bolt so the hole is completely unobstructed, and then pour a little bit of brake fluid in. I'm not gonna go crazy yet because it may just start flowing out on its own, but I see that it's not, so I'm gonna keep going a little more. I've got a rag handy just in case. So right now the master cylinder is about halfway full, and so 1 pump and it's already coming out. So this one is flowing nicely. If you're struggling to get this to start pumping fluid, the best thing to do is use your thumb and lightly cover the hole, pump it, and you'll feel air pressure pushing out. So you let the air out, but don't let any air back in. So you have to have enough pressure, but not too much. And if you keep doing this, it's gonna start really flowing fluid. So mine is fully primed and ready to go. The next step is to grab the line and figure out which side is going to be easiest to put against the master cylinder. So just make sure that if you need to rotate now's your chance. You grab your banjo bolt, and again, like at the caliper, you have 1 washer on the banjo bolt. Put it through the fitting, put your other washer in, and screw into the master cylinder. So temporarily, we're gonna have the brake line vertically and tighten it down just a little bit. And the reason for this is it helps get the air bubbles out through the line and up into the master cylinder. Kind of gives it a more straight shot. So we'll just barely snug it down to where it's not leaking. Not gonna be putting a ton of pressure on this. With the master cylinder banjo bolt tight, we're now gonna tighten up this lower banjo bolt. Doesn't have to be anything crazy. So now you can grab the bleed hose and stick it onto the bleed nipple. And then we're just going to crack this open a little bit. So now fluid can freely flow from the master cylinder down to the caliper. All right, so now with the whole system tight, minus the bleed nipple, I'm just gonna fill the master cylinder up with fluid completely. So now I'm gonna pump the master cylinder for a while until I start seeing fluid coming out of the bleed hose down there. And I'm already seeing the fluid level dropping and air bubbles coming out of the holes down in here. So as I'm pumping the master cylinder up here, there's just a ton of bubbles coming out of the bottom of the master cylinder. And now you can start seeing a few bubbles coming out of the caliper, which is great as I pump it. And so ideally you'd have something there to catch those drips. We're gonna have to find a paper towel to clean some of that up. Okay, so through this process, I'm just continuously pumping this, and there's a ton of bubbles still coming out of here. You gotta think this whole line is filled with air, and so we gotta get all the fluid through the whole line and into the caliper, and there's some big cavities in the caliper that have to be filled with fluid as well. So the secret for getting as many bubbles out of here as possible is kind of dropping the handle, creating vibrations to work those bubbles out of this line. Throughout this whole process, make sure that this master cylinder is always full of fluid, or at least not near the bottom of the bowl. Because if you suck air in now, then that's just going to create problems. So I'm going to keep doing this until I see that I'm pumping significant amounts of fluid out of the caliper. Because what this is telling me right now is I'm pumping here, there's a bunch of air bubbles coming out, and I'm still just filling this line. The fluid hasn't fully reached down to the caliper yet. All right, so we've been working at this for maybe 10-15 minutes, and there's a lot less bubbles coming out of here now in the master cylinder. And it's also kind of, as you press the lever, sometimes it's squirting up. So it's making pressure. And when I do that, you can see there's quite a bit of fluid that comes out down at the caliper now. So now we're gonna tighten up the bleed nipple and start getting into a more traditional bleeding process. Bleed nipple's tight. I'm gonna put my wrench on it. And what we're gonna be doing is pumping up the master cylinder a couple times, and then cracking this valve open, and bubbles start coming out. So this tube helps greatly with allowing the fluid and the bubbles out, but preventing air from going back in. So we're gonna do this a number of times until we stop seeing bubbles come out when we release the pressure. And the idea here is that you're only cracking it open for a second or so. So really before the fluid stops flowing, because you don't want to allow a chance for air to get back in, like through past the threads or something. So we're going to pump it up another 3 or 5 times, crack this valve open, and we get a few more bubbles. And always make sure that the master cylinder reservoir is still full of fluid. Okay, I've done this a few times now. I'm not getting any more bubbles out of here, but I still don't have brake feel, which is to be expected, not surprising to me. What we have to do now is unbolt the caliper from the rotor. So we only had it lightly on here, just can loosen it by hand. So included in the kit is this red brake bleed tool. So what it does is it goes into this caliper and kind of mimics the brake rotor, just like that. So now you can bleed with the caliper at different angles, which is really what we need. So the best way to think about this is these 2 pistons are fully hollow, the full depth of this caliper, and they're full of air right now because it was at kind of a slight angle, so the bubbles were trapped in there. So what we need to do is allow those air bubbles to work their way to the top and it kind of guide them up and out of this bleed port. So I'm gonna kind of angle it like this, and this is where you really could use a friend to hold the master cylinder and pump it. So Trey, I'm gonna need you to help out a little bit. Okay, so Buddy's gonna pump it up 3 or 5 times, and then on the last one he's gonna hold it tight. And I'm just gonna simply crack this open like I was before, but kind of holding it at an angle like this time. All right. All right, so after using the bleed tool and moving the caliper all over, we got what seemed to be most all the bubbles out of it. I'm not 100% sure that we're done with that process yet. We might have to revisit it, but we're definitely doing a lot better. Still don't really have any brake feel in the master yet. Screw this screw in just enough to get rid of the slop in the handle. No more than just getting rid of that slop. Okay, so yeah, now it's got no wiggle room, and I'll just give it a little tighten on the jam nut. Now that we're most of the way bled, I'm just gonna rotate this fitting, so it's gonna introduce a tiny little bit of air, but I'm just gonna barely loosen it and rotate and tighten it back down, just getting it to where we want it to be permanently. I'm back with the red tool. I'm gonna try a few more angles because I still think we have got some air bubbles in there. It's not quite firm enough yet, so I think there's still some bubbles hiding in here. So I'm gonna try a few more different angles, and Buddy's gonna pump the brakes and hold it, and I'm gonna crack that open, and I think we just got a bubble there, so we'll do that a few more times. The handle's getting progressively better, so we're just gonna keep on with this. All right, so we've made a proper mess now, but I think we are just about good. I'm gonna go ahead and take this red tool out. When the red tool is out, make sure not to press that brake lever until you have it back onto the rotor. I'm gonna go ahead and take this little hose off. We'll definitely need to come back to that in a little bit after we go on a ride, but I think now it's time to clean up, bolt this down, and bolt up the master cylinder, get it ready for a test ride. Best way to clean all this up is, my favorite thing is just get isopropyl alcohol and soak everything all around here. Make sure you get the rotor, the caliper, and anywhere that it's sprayed, and same goes for the master cylinder. Just clean everything up. Once this is all clean, I'm gonna bolt it down and we'll take it for a test ride. So when you're tightening this bracket down, you need to go slowly and jump between the 2 screws. So right now, Buddy's holding the brake, and that's aligning the caliper perfectly to the rotor. And I'm just gonna do a little tightening there. That's already hand tight. A little tightening on this side. So this adjuster right here, if you put it in too far, you might be inclined to compensate for a weak feeling lever, a not fully bled system, by tightening this in, but that is only going to result in disaster. This screw should only be tight enough to pick up the slack of this lever and no further. If you don't have enough brake feel with that adjusted properly, then that means there's still air in the line somewhere. So you're gonna have to go back, maybe ride it a little bit and work some air bubbles out and keep bleeding. But Adjusting this to compensate for a weak feeling lever is not the solution. Definitely be sure to reach out if you have any troubles or comments, questions, and we'll get back to you. Stick around for part 2 where we install the foot brake and put on the second caliper. It's a new day and we took the bike on a ride for a while to bed in the new brakes. We only have the handbrake on right now and we've got all the air out of the system. So after riding, we did have to come back, bleed it a little more. Today we're going to be installing the new foot brake. So this is the bracket that goes on here and replaces this. We'll be putting this on, running the second brake line, and installing the second caliper. First thing we're going to do is take off the foot peg and then unbolt this bracket, and this one has a cross member installed, so we'll take that out as well. With that bracket installed, we're going to install the foot brake peg and the master cylinder onto here with the supplied screws. So to install the master cylinder, we've got to take out this pin and feed the pin through the brake lever. So to do that, just have to straighten out this cotter pin, pull it out of there, and then the big pin comes out. And from there we can go ahead and line it up on there, feed it through. With that pin through, then we'll put the cotter pin back in place and bend its ears so it can't slide out. With that attached, then we can put the screws in here. Then we can put the peg back on. There is an optional spring that you can run between these 2 points, but a lot of people feel that there's enough resistance as is once this is all bled. So it's optional to run this guy. The brake line that comes with the kit has 2 different ends, so you'll see this one has a 45-degree angle on it, and this one is similar to the front brake with a bit of an angle on it there. So the more extreme angle goes onto the master cylinder here. So we'll just start by taking off the banjo bolt, and again, 1 washer on the bolt, feed it through, and then another washer sandwiching it. The best routing we've found for the brake line goes under the suspension triangle, so you can kind of feed it through in front of the shock, but under the triangle, and screw that in by hand. I'm going to go ahead and tighten this down now. I think this is good placement. Coming around to the other side of the bike, we can now connect the brake line to the second master cylinder. Same as this one. A lot of this process is just going to be the exact same. With the second caliper, you can kind of put it roughly in its place here, just so if you start squeezing the pads, it clamps onto the rotor and doesn't overextend. So we'll just leave it roughly there for a minute. Maybe you gotta zip tie it up or something. With the caliper roughly in place, we're gonna open up the master cylinder and put some brake fluid in so we can start the bleeding process. This thing's flopping all over, so I'm gonna put 1 screw in just gently here. The caliper's gonna come back off in a minute, so I'm just gonna barely put it on just to hold it in place. But The next thing we're going to do is to connect the bleed hose. Now I've got a longer hose with a bigger bottle, but you can use the small hose provided and drill a hole in the top of just a normal water bottle and stick it in there to try and catch the fluid. We didn't have a bottle when we did this one, but it's a pro tip that saves a lot of headache and mess. And now the master's full of fluid, but there's air in the entire system. So for now, I'm just gonna crack this open and we'll start pumping the brake until fluid comes out of here. You kind of need somebody else pumping the brake while you're working back here. I decided to take this off of here and put in the brake bleeding tool in between the pads, and then got my wrench here and the hose connected. It's sealed up right now, but your friend is gonna pump the brakes a few times and then hold them tight. And just like before, you're gonna release this pressure as he's holding it and then close it back up pretty quick. So it's important to hold the brake caliper at kind of an angle like this. If you think about the bubble path, they're in these big chambers in here and you want to get them up here. So kind of like gravity, you raise them up to the top, and then as he's holding, we're gonna blow them out. Yeah, so that just got a huge bubble in there. We're starting to get tension at the foot pedal, which is great. We're getting a lot of bubbles coming out of here. The pistons are starting to extend. So now you really need that red brake tool in there to imitate the brake pad. So I'm holding the caliper kind of at its side, like I mentioned, get the bubbles up to the top so it's an easier path out. We're just going to keep doing this now until the bubbles stop coming, and throughout the whole process, absolutely make sure that the master cylinder is full of fluid. If you suck in any air up there, then you got to start the process over. So we're just going to keep going until we don't see any more bubbles. We haven't gotten bubbles for a while, so I'm going to take out the bleed tool and we're going to put it back onto the rotor here. It all is a mess and kind of covered with brake fluid because the hose came off at one point, but we'll clean it up in a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and start attaching this caliper to the brackets here. Don't tighten it down fully yet. I'm just kind of leaving it loose. We need isopropyl alcohol to clean this off a little bit. Just kind of douse it and get all that brake fluid that I spilled off of here. With the friend holding down the brake, you're gonna tighten these screws down. I do little by little, so a little on one screw, and then a little tightening over here. Then we'll go back. And this just helps ensure that the caliper is nicely centered onto the rotor. With that bleeding done, I'm just gonna put this lid back on, tighten it down. All that's left now is just some tidying up. So I'm gonna zip tie this. I'm gonna put one zip tie right here, kind of attaching the foot brake line to the handbrake line. And once that's done, I'll put a zip tie up here somewhere as well. So I'm gonna start back here. Now we got both our Moto brakes installed. Thanks for purchasing the kit. Definitely reach out if you have any issues or questions, and we'll see you on the next cool project.